Tonight the world watches Iran. Missiles move, alliances tighten, war seems to hover in the air like a gathering storm. But what if the most important battle in Iran is not the one on the news? What if something else is happening, quietly, beneath the noise of geopolitics? Because while governments argue and armies prepare, another movement is spreading through the country, one that cannot be tracked by satellites or military analysts. In hidden apartments, in whispered prayers behind closed curtains, in Bibles passed from hand to hand under the cover of night. In a nation where conversion can cost everything, thousands are searching for the message of a man from Galilee who lived 2,000 years ago. And suddenly a strange question begins to rise. Why Iran? Because in the Bible, Iran has another name, Persia. And Persia was never just another empire. It was a nation mysteriously woven into the prophetic timeline of Scripture. And to understand what may be happening today, we must begin where that story truly starts. For decades, Iran has been known as one of the most tightly controlled religious environments in the modern world. A nation where religious identity is closely watched, where conversion from Islam can carry serious consequences, and where public Christian activity is limited and often monitored. On paper, it would seem like the least likely place on earth for Christianity to grow. And yet something remarkable has been unfolding beneath the surface of this ancient land. Not in grand cathedrals, not in public revivals, but in quiet apartments behind closed doors where small groups gather after dark. In these hidden rooms, the lights are low, voices are soft. Sometimes only 3 or 4 people sit together around a small table. A worn Bible rests between them. A passage is read slowly. Questions are asked. Prayers are whispered. These gatherings are known as house churches. Across cities like Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz, networks of these small fellowships have quietly formed. They do not advertise their presence. There are no signs on the streets, no announcements in public squares. Yet researchers studying religious movements in the Middle East have increasingly acknowledged something unexpected, a quiet but noticeable rise in interest in the Christian faith among some Iranians. Many who explore this faith are young students, professionals, seekers who feel caught between ancient tradition and modern uncertainty. Some encounter the message of Jesus through satellite television broadcasts in Persian. Others through online Bible studies, digital scripture apps, or conversations with friends who share their own stories of belief. And for many of them, the attraction is not political, it is deeply personal. They speak of the teachings of Jesus about forgiveness, mercy, and sacrificial love. They speak of a God who enters human suffering rather than ruling from a distance. And in a region long shaped by complex political struggles, that message resonates in surprising ways. This does not mean every report is easy to measure. Religious movements that grow quietly are difficult to count. Estimates vary widely. But multiple scholars and mission researchers have suggested that hundreds of thousands of Iranians have at least explored the teachings of Christianity in recent decades, often through informal and private communities. In many parts of the world, faith fades where comfort grows. But history shows that in some places, faith deepens precisely where it faces pressure. The early Christian movement itself spread through secret gatherings in the Roman Empire long before churches were built. Now echoes of that ancient pattern seem to appear again, not with crowds in stadiums, but with small circles of people reading scripture in the quiet of night. Some believers inside Iran describe this moment with a word rarely heard in political analysis. They call it awakening. Not a national movement organized by institutions, but a quiet turning of individual hearts, a search for meaning beyond ideology, beyond power, beyond fear. Whether one sees it as sociology, curiosity, or spiritual hunger, the phenomenon raises a remarkable question. Why would such a search be emerging in a land known historically as Persia, a nation that already holds a mysterious place in the pages of the Bible? Because long before these hidden gatherings ever began, Persia had already appeared in Scripture in ways that changed the course of biblical history. And to understand that ancient connection, we must step back thousands of years into the royal courts of an empire that once ruled the world. To understand why Iran still echoes through biblical conversation today, we must travel far beyond modern headlines back to an age of empires long before the name Iran existed. In the ancient world, this land was known as Persia, a vast empire stretching from the mountains of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean. Roads carved through deserts, royal palaces glittering with gold, and stone armies moving across continents under the banners of kings whose authority seemed almost limitless. Yet in the pages of the Bible, Persia appears in a way no other empire does, not merely as a conquering power, but as a stage where divine providence quietly unfolds. One of the most dramatic examples is found in the story of Esther. Inside the Persian capital, likely the magnificent city of Susa, a young Jewish woman rose to become queen of the empire. Her name was Hadassah, though history remembers her as Esther. At that moment in history, the Jewish people were scattered across the Persian realm, vulnerable, exiled, dependent on the decisions of a foreign court. And within that court, a powerful official named Haman devised a terrifying plan, an empire-wide decree, a single day when the Jewish people would be destroyed. The order moved through the provinces like a shadow of death, history balanced on the edge of a blade. But in the silence of the palace, something unexpected happened. Esther chose courage over safety. She approached the king uninvited, a decision that could have cost her life and revealed the conspiracy. The plot collapsed. Haman fell from power, and the people who were meant to be erased from history survived. The entire turning point of that story unfolded not in Jerusalem, but in Persia. And then another astonishing moment appears in Scripture. A king who had not yet been born. More than a century before his rise, the prophet Isaiah recorded a name that would puzzle readers for generations: Cyrus, a ruler from the east who would overthrow Babylon. But the prophecy went further. It declared that this foreign king would become the instrument through which God would restore Jerusalem. When Cyrus the Great finally entered Babylon in 539 BC, history shifted in a single decree. He allowed the Jewish exiles to return home. He authorized the rebuilding of the temple, and remarkably archaeological discoveries such as the Cyrus cylinder confirm that this Persian king issued policies of restoration for displaced peoples across his empire, a pagan emperor, helping rebuild the spiritual center of Israel. At that moment, Persia became something extraordinary in biblical history. Not the destroyer of God's people, but the empire that opened the door for their return. Which leads to a realization that many readers miss. Persia was never treated in Scripture as a random power rising and falling like so many others. Instead, it appears as a nation mysteriously woven into the unfolding timeline of God's purposes. And if Persia once stood at the center of such a turning point in history, then the next question becomes impossible to ignore. Because Persia appears again, this time not in history but in prophecy. Persia's story in the Bible does not end with Esther's courage or Cyrus's decree. It appears again centuries later in one of the most mysterious prophetic passages in all of Scripture. The words were written by the prophet Ezekiel during Israel's exile at a time when empires were rising and falling like storms across the ancient world. In chapters 38 and 39, Ezekiel describes a future moment when a powerful coalition of nations will move toward the land of Israel. A leader called Gog gathers allies from distant regions. Nations are listed one by one, names that once belonged to ancient territories scattered across the map of the Near East. And among them, quietly but unmistakably, appears a familiar name: Persia. For the first readers of Ezekiel, Persia was not yet the empire that would later dominate the region. But the prophecy places it among the participants in a future alignment of nations surrounding Israel. For centuries, theologians, historians, and students of prophecy have wrestled with this passage. Some interpret it symbolically. Others see it as a geopolitical picture that may unfold near the closing chapters of human history. The text itself does not describe modern military technology or specific contemporary nations. Instead, it paints a sweeping prophetic vision, an alliance moving toward confrontation, and a divine intervention that halts it. Because the focus is not ultimately on armies, or alliances, or even the battlefield. The focus shifts to something far greater: God declares that the purpose of this moment is that the nations will know who He is. History, in other words, is not drifting without direction. Even the most chaotic events in the world are not beyond the reach of divine sovereignty. And here is the deeper tension that runs through biblical prophecy. Empires believe they control the future. Generals believe strategy determines history. But the scriptures consistently remind readers of something humbling. The final chapter of history does not belong to emperors. It belongs to God, which means the role of Persia, ancient or modern, is not simply political. It is part of a much larger story that stretches from the courts of ancient kings to the promises of restoration found in the final pages of the Bible. A story that moves toward a moment Christians believe will culminate in the return of Christ and the renewal of creation itself. And so today, when the world hears the name Iran in the language of geopolitics and conflict, the Bible quietly invites us to see something deeper, a nation whose ancient name appears in both history and prophecy, a land woven into the unfolding drama of Scripture, and a reminder that while headlines change every day, the greater story of redemption continues to move forward steadily, purposefully, toward the ending God has already written. Tonight we followed a quiet thread through history, from hidden house churches in modern Iran, to the royal courts of ancient Persia, to the mysterious prophecies written by Ezekiel thousands of years ago. What first looked like politics slowly revealed something deeper, a story moving beneath the surface of history. A reminder that empires rise and fall, but the purposes of God continue to unfold across generations. Perhaps the most striking truth is this: the places the world watches for conflict may also be the places where faith quietly awakens. And that leaves us with a question worth carrying beyond this video. What if history is not random, but moving toward a destination already written? If this journey opened a new perspective for you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves exploring biblical mysteries, and subscribe to continue this path with us. And in the comments, share your thoughts. What part of this story surprised you the most? Stay with us and watch the next video appearing on your screen. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries of Scripture are not behind us, they are waiting just ahead.